It began not with a scream, but with a whisper carried on the wind. A whisper so faint that most men would have dismissed it as the idle hiss of heat rising off the earth. But for Samuel, bent low beneath the sun's relentless eye, that whisper tore the fabric of his world in two. The fields stretched wide and merciless, a kingdom of dust and cotton stalks, where every breath came laced with the taste of soil and sweat. Chains rattled softly at his ankles, each step reminding him of the weight he was born into, a weight that had no end. And yet, even in this prison of dust and fire, there was one light that had kept him alive, Amara. She moved like a shadow through the rows, her back bent as his was, her skin marked with the same lashings, her hands calloused from the same endless toil. But when she looked at him, when her eyes met his across the long expanse of suffering, something softer bloomed. It was a fragile rebellion. A smile in a world where smiling was forbidden, a touch in the dark that reminded him he was still a man, not only a beast in chains. That day, Samuel stole glances at her the way a dying man steals sips of water. Every flicker of her form was a lifeline, every brush of her voice a tether to sanity. And then, the overseer's voice cut the air like a whip. Not a shout, not a command. Just a careless mutter to another, words that drifted through the rows like smoke from a fire no one wanted to see. She's gone. Sold off. Master struck a fine bargain. The words hit Samuel harder than any blow ever had. For a moment, the earth seemed to still beneath him. The sun's glare sharpened, burning his skin, but all he could feel was cold, a hollow, suffocating cold that spread through his chest like frost. He stopped working, his hands falling limp against the crop. The overseer laughed, spitting into the dirt, and moved on without a second thought. But for Samuel, those words had carved a scar deeper than any lash. Amara, his light, his anchor, the one fragile proof that love could survive in a world built on cruelty, had been traded like livestock, her humanity weighed against silver, her body reduced to a ledger entry. He raised his head, his eyes searching the fields for her shape. But where she should have been, there was only emptiness. Only the wind moving through the rows, whispering like a ghost. The chains at his ankles clinked when he shifted, sounding suddenly louder than ever before, like funeral bells tolling a death no one would mourn. His throat tightened. No words came. He wanted to cry out her name, to run, to tear through the rows until he found her. But the silence inside him was too heavy, too final. The men and women working nearby sensed it too. They did not meet his eyes, but their hands stilled, their breaths quickened. Even they felt the air change, thick with something unseen. The sun above did not relent, yet a shadow seemed to fall over the land, a shadow that was not from any cloud. Samuel bent low again, his hands moving with mechanical obedience, but his mind had left the field. The whisper replayed again and again, each syllable searing deeper. Sold. Gone. Bargain. Words that would not let him breathe. And as he worked in silence, the world grew sharper. The cotton's thorns cut deeper. The air pressed heavier against his lungs. Even the soil beneath his feet seemed restless, as if the land itself understood what had been taken from him. By the time the sun dipped lower, his soul had already begun to change. Something inside him, something long held back by love, by hope, by Amara, had cracked. And in that crack, darkness began to pour. The cabin was smaller than a stable, its walls thin enough for the wind to slip through, but to Samuel it had always been a sanctuary. Within those walls, in the fragile hours when overseers slept and dogs quieted, he and Amara had built a world of whispers and touch. A world where scars could be traced tenderly, where silence carried comfort instead of chains. But when Samuel stumbled back that evening, dragging the dust of the fields on his boots, he found only absence waiting for him. The bed, a crude frame of wood and straw, lay stripped of her presence. No warmth clung to the blanket. No soft breath filled the corner where she always curled against him when the night turned cold. Her dress, the faded one with the threadbare hem she mended over and over, was gone. The comb she used to tame her hair, gone. Even the smallest tokens of her had vanished, as though the air itself had conspired to erase her. Samuel's knees buckled beneath him. He sank to the floorboards, rough wood biting into his skin, and pressed his palms against the ground as if to feel for her ghost. His fingers spread across the boards, trembling, desperate, as though the grain might still hold the echo of her footsteps. He closed his eyes, but the silence was unbearable. For years, Samuel had endured silence, the kind forced upon him by masters, the kind that settled after a lash cut through skin. But this silence was different. This silence carried her absence in every corner, and it was louder than screams. It pressed against his chest, crawling into his lungs until breathing became a labor of grief. He opened his mouth, wanting to call her name, but the sound died before it left his throat. What good was her name in a world that had traded her like cattle? To call for her now would be to admit he had lost her forever. Instead, he let the quiet consume him. On the small table, a cup lay overturned, the last drops of water still dampening the wood. He imagined her hand had been the last to touch it, that perhaps she had set it down gently before being led away. The thought poisoned him, her hands, so careful, so kind, now ripped from him, perhaps bound, perhaps already forced to serve another man's cruelty. His chest tightened. He turned to the wall, to the faint carvings they had etched with a nail years ago. Marks of passing time, notched lines for each day endured, each day survived. Amara had once joked that the wall carried more memory than either of them, holding their survival in its scars. Samuel reached for the carvings, dragging his fingertips over them, feeling the grooves like wounds. Those marks were theirs, proof of their togetherness, and now they mocked him with their permanence. His silence grew heavier, darker. It was the kind of silence that turns into a storm, building quietly, waiting to break. The others in the quarters must have felt it, for no one came to the door, no one dared interrupt. They knew better. They knew when a man's grief had sharpened into something dangerous. Samuel stayed on the floor, his head bowed as if in prayer, though there were no prayers left in him. He thought of Amara's laughter, light and fleeting, like water slipping between fingers. He thought of her hand in his, strong even when trembling. Each memory rose like smoke, choking him. They were not comforts. They were ashes. Hours passed, though he could not mark them. The light dimmed, shadows thickened, the cabin became a coffin of memory. He did not move, not even when the night wrapped the land in its cloak. Still he stayed, a man carved into stillness, emptied of voice, emptied of tears. But in the pit of that stillness, in the depth of that silence, something began to stir. It was not hope. Hope had been stolen with Amara. No, this was darker, a quiet resolve, a coiling storm. And by the time the moon rose high, Samuel's silence had turned into a promise. A promise that blood would answer the bargain. Night did not bring rest. It brought ghosts. Samuel sat against the wall of the cabin, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind prowled restlessly through memories, dragging him back to fragments of Amara that refused to fade. Every flicker of firelight on the wall seemed to shape her face, every groan of the timber floor sounded like her step returning. But when he reached for her in the shadows, there was only emptiness. It was then that the memories began to flood, unbidden yet merciless. He remembered her hands first roughened by toil, marked by blisters, yet still soft when they found him. He remembered how she would take a rag soaked in river water and press it against his lashes, her touch steady even as his skin burned. She said little then, but her silence carried kindness. In those quiet gestures, he had found refuge. He remembered her laughter next, though it came rarely. Not loud, never reckless. Only a quick, fragile sound, often muffled behind her hand, like she was afraid the air itself might punish her for joy. Yet that laugh had been a balm, a sound that reminded him they were still human, still capable of light even when the world had buried them in shadow. Now, thinking of it, he felt the echo clawing at his chest, like a bird trapped in a cage too small to fly. Then came her words. Words whispered in the dark when the fields lay silent and overseers snored in drunken stupor. She would curl beside him and speak dreams too dangerous to name in the light of day. Dreams of a place where chains could not follow, where the air did not taste of dust and blood. Samuel had never dared to believe in such a place, but in her voice it had sounded possible. Not because the world would grant it, but because she believed it could exist, and in her belief, he had found something to hold on to. But now every memory turned cruel. Her hands haunted him not with comfort but with absence. Her laughter rang hollow, mocking him with the knowledge that he would never hear it again. Her whispered dreams burned like coals in his throat, because the only dream left to him now was vengeance. The cabin walls closed in around him, heavy with the weight of her absence. He felt as though the space itself mocked him. He reached for the small wooden spoon she used when cooking, held it in his palm, and for a moment it felt like holding her hand. But when he looked down, he saw only wood, splintered and lifeless. He dropped it, the sound striking the floor like a coffin nail. Samuel pressed his head against the wall, his eyes shut tight. He tried to will the memories away, but they clung to him like scars, permanent, seared into his flesh. The more he tried to banish them, the clearer they became. He could hear her voice now, whispering his name in the dark, could almost feel her breath warm against his neck. He turned, reaching for her, but his hand closed on air. The silence that followed was unbearable. It pressed on him until he thought he would suffocate. He opened his mouth, and at last, sound broke free. Not a word, not a cry, but a low, broken groan, torn from somewhere deep within, raw enough to frighten even himself. That sound lingered in the room like smoke after fire, filling the space where Amara should have been. Samuel's shoulders trembled, but no tears came. He had gone beyond tears. Beyond grief. What remained was sharper, heavier, forged from the ashes of memory. The ghosts did not leave him. They settled into his bones, curling tight around his heart, their presence both torment and fuel. Each memory of her that rose like salt on his wounds only carved his resolve deeper. By the time dawn's first light crept through the cracks in the cabin wall, Samuel was no longer the same man who had stumbled home the night before. He had been emptied and refilled with something darker, something that gave his silence a new shape. The world had taken Amara from him. Now the world would answer. The big house rose against the horizon like a scar across the land. Its whitewashed walls gleamed faintly under the swollen moon, too bright, too clean, as if mocking the darkness that surrounded it. Samuel stood in the shadows of the trees, his body still and silent, eyes fixed on the windows glowing with firelight. From within spilled the sound of laughter, sharp, jagged, cutting through the night like glass. He knew that laugh. It was the laugh of the man who owned him. The man who had owned Amara. The man who had sold her. The master's voice rolled out into the night, buoyed by wine and arrogance, each sound a knife twisting deeper into Samuel's chest. Through the window, he could see the feast laid out across a long wooden table. Meat dripping with fat, pitchers of red wine tipped into silver cups, bread torn by careless hands. The master sat at the head of it all, his face flushed, his body swollen with indulgence. Around him gathered other men, neighbors and traders, their bellies full, their eyes glazed, laughing at stories that stank of cruelty. Samuel could not hear every word, but he heard enough. Got a fine price for her, the master boasted, slamming his cup against the table. Wine splashed, staining the cloth like blood. They wanted a strong one, and she was strong. Didn't take no coaxing. Walked right out like she knew her place. The men around him chuckled, some nervously, others with open delight. Dogs circled under the table, snapping at scraps tossed carelessly down. Servants moved in and out, heads bowed, their silence carrying the weight of fear. But Samuel's gaze never left the master. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, though his body remained hidden in shadow. The laughter grated against him, seeping into his bones until it seemed the whole world was laughing at him. At Amara. At the fragile kindness they had dared to carve out in the cracks of this cruel place. The master raised his cup again, his voice booming. A man's got to know how to bargain. Everything has a price. Everything. The words echoed, louder in Samuel's mind than they had been spoken. Everything has a price. The master leaned back, smug, and in that moment Samuel saw not just the man, but the entire world that had allowed him to exist. The entire order built on chains and cruelty, dressed up in fine clothes and red wine. He pressed his forehead against the tree's bark, the rough surface cutting into his skin, grounding him. His breath came slow, deliberate, each inhalation thick with the scent of earth and sap. But inside, something coiled tighter, darker. The silence he had carried from the fields to the cabin now followed him here, but it was no longer hollow. It was heavy, dangerous, like a storm crouched low on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. Inside the hall, one of the guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to the window. Perhaps he felt it too, the unnatural stillness beyond the light, the shadow that watched without blinking. But he said nothing. The master's laughter filled the room again, drowning out doubt, smothering unease. Samuel did not move. He let the sound wash over him, let it carve itself into his memory, let it sharpen the edge already forming in his hands and in his heart. He had no knife yet, no weapon but his silence, but in that silence, he carried the weight of inevitability. The dogs barked once, sudden and sharp, noses raised toward the night. The men cursed, kicking them aside, laughing again to cover their unease. But Samuel remained still, a shadow among shadows, his eyes burning as he watched the man who had stolen his world and sold it for silver. When the last burst of laughter rang out, splitting the night in two, Samuel's lips moved at last. Not a cry, not a curse, but a whisper so faint it barely stirred the air. Everything has a price. And in that whisper, the storm inside him began to break. The night had grown heavy, thick with a stillness that pressed against the skin like damp cloth. The big house, with its drunken laughter fading to murmurs, seemed far away now. Samuel had slipped from the shadows of the trees into the hidden arteries of the estate, moving as if guided by something older than himself, older than chains, older than cruelty. The kitchen was still awake, faintly alive with the hum of coals buried in ash. A single candle burned on the wooden table, its flame bending low, as though fearful of the silence that clung to the room. The smell of roasted meat and spilled wine lingered, sour and heavy. Samuel's bare feet made no sound on the stone floor. He did not stumble, did not hesitate. His body moved with a clarity that was not thought but instinct, as though the night itself had chosen him to bear its weight. On the table, knives lay scattered, tools of the feast, their edges dulled by grease in careless hands. He stood before them, his shadow trembling against the wall, but his hands did not. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for one. Its handle was rough, worn by years of cutting bread and bone. When he lifted it, the weight settled into his palm with eerie familiarity, as though it had been waiting for him. The candlelight caught the blade, sending a fractured shimmer across his face. His eyes reflected it, not with rage, but with something colder, steadier. The silence inside him had hardened into steel. His chest rose and fell, but his breaths were shallow, as though his body feared to break the spell that now bound him. In the corner of the kitchen, a servant girl stirred. She had been cleaning, quietly, her back bent to the work no one else saw. When her eyes lifted, they fell upon Samuel, and for a heartbeat the world froze. She saw the knife, the stillness, the shadow of something vast and terrible behind his gaze. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Perhaps she thought of crying out, of warning the house above. But her eyes held too much knowledge. She had seen the master's cruelty. She had heard the whispers of Amara's sale. She had watched Samuel break in silence day after day, and now she saw him reborn in that same silence. Slowly, she lowered her gaze and continued her work, hands moving with studied calm. Samuel turned away from her without a word. His silence was heavier than any oath, more binding than any prayer. He walked toward the door, the knife clutched at his side, its edge catching the flicker of the candle like a sliver of moonlight. In the corridor beyond, shadows leaned long against the walls. The house above still pulsed with muffled laughter, though fainter now, drunken and frayed. Every footstep Samuel took seemed to echo with a sound that was not heard but felt, a drumbeat rising from the floorboards into his bones. The knife was not just a weapon now. It was memory. It was the ghost of Amara's touch. It was the last fragment of humanity torn from him, reshaped into something sharp enough to pierce the world that had devoured her. Each step carried him closer to the place where laughter still rang, closer to the man who believed everything had a price. Behind him, the candle guttered, then died. The kitchen fell into darkness. Samuel did not look back. He walked forward into silence, into shadow, into inevitability. And with every step, the air seemed to tremble, as though the house itself sensed what was coming, though it could not yet speak its fear. The hall smelled of smoke and spilled liquor, a haze of indulgence hanging over polished wood and velvet curtains. The master's laughter, shrill and jagged, rattled against the walls like iron dragged over stone. Samuel moved toward it as though drawn by some ancient current, his bare feet silent against the floorboards, the knife still gripped tight at his side. The door to the great room stood ajar. Light spilled through the crack, golden and warm, yet twisted by cruelty. Samuel stood there for a moment, breathing the air thick with roasted meat, pipe smoke, and arrogance. The voices within swelled and fell like waves. The master's voice rose above them all, proud and cruel, retelling the story of a deal struck, of a woman sold as though she were cattle, his words sharpened by wine and malice. Samuel pushed the door open. Inside, men sat around the long table, their faces flushed and gleaming. Candles dripped wax onto silver plates, their flames struggling against the heavy air. The master stood at the head of the table, his chest swollen with pride, his hand gripping a glass that trembled from his drunken gesturing. When his eyes landed on Samuel, the laughter faltered for a moment. The room stilled. Guests turned, confusion furrowing their brows. Samuel stepped forward. His figure was gaunt but unwavering, the knife hidden within the shadow of his arm. His eyes did not flinch. They burned with a stillness so profound it unsettled even the boldest of men. The master sneered, his pride unbent. "Well now, look who dares wander into my hall." His words slurred with drink, but the venom was clear. "You should be in the fields, Samuel, not sulking in shadows." Samuel said nothing. The silence pressed on every man in the room, heavier than the storm winds outside. The master's smirk widened, feeding off the eyes upon him. "Or perhaps you came to beg. To whine about the wench I sold. She was never yours, boy. She was mine to barter, mine to cast aside. And I did." Gasps stirred among the guests, nervous eyes darting between them. One man shifted in his chair as though the air itself were wrong. But Samuel did not speak. His silence was a blade before the blade. The master's voice sharpened. "What is this? Do you think yourself a man? Do you think you could raise a hand against me? Against the man who owns you?" Still nothing. Samuel stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his weight. He raised the knife into the light. The master barked out a laugh, though unease flickered in his eyes. "You wouldn't dare." The words cut short when steel met flesh. The motion was sudden, yet it felt inevitable, as though time itself had been bending toward this moment all along. The knife sank into the master's chest. His laughter broke into a guttural gasp, crimson staining the silk of his shirt. His glass shattered against the floor, wine spilling like blood before the real thing followed. Chaos erupted. Guests stumbled to their feet, chairs crashing, voices shrieking. But Samuel did not falter. His face was calm, eerily calm, as if carved from stone. No rage twisted his features. No triumph lifted his brow. He held the knife steady until the master crumpled, the life draining from him like sand through a broken hourglass. When the master collapsed onto the table, sending plates and candles tumbling, Samuel released the knife. It clattered against the wood, a sound sharp and final. The flames of the fallen candles licked at the spilled wine, sputtering in tiny bursts, as though the house itself recoiled from what had been done. In that instant, silence returned. Not the silence of fear, nor of grief, but a silence older than words, the silence of reckoning. Samuel stood in it like a monument, his shadow cast long by the trembling light. And for the first time, the master's hall knew what it was to bow. The room erupted the moment the master's body stilled, a storm breaking loose inside four walls. Glass shattered beneath frantic boots, chairs scraped, and voices rose like panicked birds. Some lunged for Samuel, others recoiled as though his very skin burned. But Samuel did not move. His chest rose and fell in calm rhythm, his gaze steady on the man crumpled before him, as though he were merely watching a shadow pass back into darkness. Then they seized him. Hands clawed at his arms, fists slammed against his ribs. The knife had clattered far from reach, but Samuel never reached for it again. He did not resist, nor did he yield. He let them strike, let them curse, let the blood spill from his split lip and bruised cheek. Every blow was absorbed into that same eerie silence, a silence that unnerved those who struck him more than the knife ever had. They dragged him from the hall, his feet scraping against polished wood, leaving faint streaks of crimson behind. His head lolled for a moment, then lifted again, eyes catching the flicker of candlelight. They burned not with rage, but with something colder, deeper, a hollow fire that seemed to see beyond the walls, beyond the night, beyond flesh itself. Out into the dirt they pulled him, the revelry behind dissolving into chaos. The stars watched in brittle silence above, cold witnesses to the reckoning that had just unfolded. Torches flared as more men joined, their shadows long and quivering on the ground. They cursed his name, spat into his face, kicked his ribs until he buckled. Yet Samuel never cried out. Not once. Blood traced down his temple, thick and warm, but his lips stayed shut. The silence stretched, so vast it seemed to swallow the curses hurled at him. The overseer who bound his wrists with rope hesitated, his own hands shaking. For in Samuel's silence there was no defeat, only something terrible and unyielding, as though the man they sought to break was already beyond breaking. Around them, the enslaved gathered in the shadows, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Women clutched children close, men clenched fists they dared not raise. Yet they watched. They whispered. Some said Samuel was mad, that he had sealed his fate with one reckless thrust. Others murmured that he had done what no one else dared, that he had struck the heart of the beast itself. The rope bit into Samuel's wrists as they hauled him upright. His feet dragged through the dirt, leaving trails like scars carved into the earth. Still he kept his silence. One of the men, drunk with fury, struck him across the back with a rifle butt. The sound cracked through the night, but Samuel did not flinch. His silence weighed heavier than screams. And so the whispers grew. He's cursed, one voice hissed. No, blessed, another countered. Not a man anymore, something else. They dragged him through the yard, past the fields where he had bent his back 1,000 times, past the cabins where laughter had once lived and Amara smile. His blood fell upon the soil like baptism, staining the ground that had stolen everything from him. Children peeked from doorways, their eyes wide and unblinking, etching his face into memory, battered, bloodied, yet strangely unbroken. At the steps of the stockade they threw him down. The dirt swallowed his breath, but he lifted his head once more. The moon caught his eyes, and in them glimmered not defeat, but eternity. Those who looked upon him faltered. For in that bloodied silence, Samuel no longer seemed like a man in chains. He seemed like a prophet carved from bone and shadow, dragged not to punishment but to legend. And though ropes bound his hands, though blood slicked his face, though the world spat its curses upon him, Samuel's silence roared louder than any cry. The room erupted the moment the master's body stilled, a storm breaking loose inside four walls. Glass shattered beneath frantic boots, chairs scraped, and voices rose like panicked birds. Some lunged for Samuel, others recoiled as though his very skin burned. But Samuel did not move. His chest rose and fell in calm rhythm, his gaze steady on the man crumpled before him, as though he were merely watching a shadow pass back into darkness. Then they seized him. Hands clawed at his arms, fists slammed against his ribs. The knife had clattered far from reach, but Samuel never reached for it again. He did not resist, nor did he yield. He let them strike, let them curse, let the blood spill from his split lip and bruised cheek. Every blow was absorbed into that same eerie silence, a silence that unnerved those who struck him more than the knife ever had. They dragged him from the hall, his feet scraping against polished wood, leaving faint streaks of crimson behind. His head lolled for a moment, then lifted again, eyes catching the flicker of candlelight. They burned not with rage, but with something colder, deeper, a hollow fire that seemed to see beyond the walls, beyond the night, beyond flesh itself. Out into the dirt they pulled him, the revelry behind dissolving into chaos. The stars watched in brittle silence above, cold witnesses to the reckoning that had just unfolded. Torches flared as more men joined, their shadows long and quivering on the ground. They cursed his name, spat into his face, kicked his ribs until he buckled. Yet Samuel never cried out. Not once. Blood traced down his temple, thick and warm, but his lips stayed shut. The silence stretched, so vast it seemed to swallow the curses hurled at him. The overseer who bound his wrists with rope hesitated, his own hands shaking. For in Samuel's silence there was no defeat, only something terrible and unyielding, as though the man they sought to break was already beyond breaking. Around them, the enslaved gathered in the shadows, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Women clutched children close, men clenched fists they dared not raise. Yet they watched. They whispered. Some said Samuel was mad, that he had sealed his fate with one reckless thrust. Others murmured that he had done what no one else dared, that he had struck the heart of the beast itself. The rope bit into Samuel's wrists as they hauled him upright. His feet dragged through the dirt, leaving trails like scars carved into the earth. Still he kept his silence. One of the men, drunk with fury, struck him across the back with a rifle butt. The sound cracked through the night, but Samuel did not flinch. His silence weighed heavier than screams. And so the whispers grew. He's cursed, one voice hissed. No, blessed, another countered. Not a man anymore, something else. They dragged him through the yard, past the fields where he had bent his back 1,000 times, past the cabins where laughter had once lived and Amara smile. His blood fell upon the soil like baptism, staining the ground that had stolen everything from him. Children peeked from doorways, their eyes wide and unblinking, etching his face into memory, battered, bloodied, yet strangely unbroken. At the steps of the stockade they threw him down. The dirt swallowed his breath, but he lifted his head once more. The moon caught his eyes, and in them glimmered not defeat, but eternity. Those who looked upon him faltered. For in that bloodied silence, Samuel no longer seemed like a man in chains. He seemed like a prophet carved from bone and shadow, dragged not to punishment but to legend. And though ropes bound his hands, though blood slicked his face, though the world spat its curses upon him, Samuel's silence roared louder than any cry.